Good morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our weekly tropical weather outlook video for today, Saturday, May 10th, 2025. Hope you're having a good week this week, and I hope you took some time this week to prepare. Since this week was Hurricane Preparedness Week, I talked about it in my video last week. Hopefully, you took some time to gather some things and come up with a plan this hurricane season, since we're now less than a month away. In fact, we'll start off right now with how many days we have till hurricane season, which starts on June 1st in the Atlantic, and this upcoming week in the Eastern Pacific. Yes, we're already at that time of year, and we're also at the time of year where we're going to have to start watching for things too, kind of giving you a little bit of a snippet to what we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the video. But we have 21 days 21 days and 15 hours till June 1st when the start of the Atlantic hurricane season will happen. So if you didn't prepare or, gather a hurricane plan this week, you still have time, but time is running out. Hurricane season is very, very soon. And one rule of thumb is always that luck favors the prepared. So we're very close to hurricane season. Got that out of the way. Let's start off with a satellite imagery of the Atlantic. Since we're now into May, things are slowly going to begin to ramp up. And what do we have across the Atlantic right now? Well, we're still in May, so we're not really in hurricane season right now. And that's very evident, obviously. If you take a look at the tropical Atlantic, we have quite a bit of dry air, especially noticeable by a lot of these lower level clouds that you see. And you also see a lot of these very strong upper level cirrus clouds moving very quickly to the northwest, indicative of strong upper level shear. Bottom line, it's May. We're getting close to the hurricane season, but obviously we're still not there atmospherically quite yet. And then kind of clear conditions all throughout the Caribbean. And then we have this sort of upper level low in the Gulf of Mexico and over the Gulf Coast. That's bringing some showers and thunderstorms to portions of northern Florida today. And we also have this system over New England, and that brought quite a bit of rain yesterday, at least to where I am here in New York City, but that's going to move out. And the rest of this weekend, at least in the Northeast, or at least from what I know from my forecast here in New York City, should be clear and sunny. So that's a good thing. But I'm focusing in specifically on the Western Atlantic because it's May 10th. Eastern Pacific hurricane season begins next week. We're generally getting to the time of the year where we start to watch for first signs of tropical development, and that typically occurs. And I always talk about this at the beginning of hurricane season. We don't look out here in the Eastern Atlantic. We always look towards the Western Atlantic. And there have been some signs, if you paid attention to the models this past week, lots of talk about maybe something trying to bundle and get going around Central America. The GFS kind of had its fun with, showing fantasy hurricanes in the Caribbean. But the models are now starting to kind of hint at maybe as we start to get into the Eastern Pacific hurricane season next week, we might actually get something on cue with the start of the Eastern Pacific season. Overall, generally part of a more favorable pattern that will make its way into the Western Atlantic very soon. And once again, on cue with the fact that hurricane season is just beginning. That time of year is coming. And taking a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, you can certainly see why we need to watch the Western Atlantic and obviously the Eastern Pacific. We have some warm anomalies here in the Eastern Pacific, although as you go a little bit further to the west, especially off the Baja Peninsula and off the southwest coast of the United States, the Eastern Pacific is quite cold. And once again, when it comes to ENSO, neutral. You don't have overwhelming cold or overwhelming warm signals, so no strong El Nino or La Nina signature. And then in the Eastern Atlantic, there's also been quite a bit of talk of the Eastern Atlantic too, because everybody was talking about, the Eastern Atlantic or the tropical Atlantic as a whole not being as warm this year, especially not compared to last year. But we've actually seen quite a bit of warming occur in the MDR, at least over the last several weeks, and I'll show you with this graph here. This is the East Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies kind of averaged out in a graph, kind of like what we do with the Nino 3.4 and take a look at the last week. Notice how much we've seen a spike in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies in the Eastern Atlantic, and then it's kind of crashed yesterday, but that's not really important. But just generally take a look at the overall trend from at least the last week or so, especially since we started the month of May. The Eastern Atlantic has warmed up quite a bit, and that got quite a bit of people talking. And it's important because the Atlantic is now beginning to warm up now, and we are just 3 weeks away from the hurricane season. And once again, we don't have any sort of major El Nino or La Nina or any major ENSO signal out here in the Pacific. These are all very important factors because this is going to help us shape the hurricane season this year. And as I said before, as long as we don't have an El Nino and the Atlantic remains decently warm, I mean, again, a lot of people talking about the Atlantic not being, as warm as maybe last year, but last year was a record warm year. So obviously we're probably not going to compare to last year, but still, just generally looking at the MDR, you can kind of see most areas are at least right where they should be to slightly above normal, and especially here towards the Caribbean and Western Atlantic, quite a bit above normal actually. Probably a lot of these values as much as a degree Celsius above normal. And as I mentioned before, we're going to have to start watching the Western Atlantic in the coming weeks as we get into mid-May. Things will start to become favorable, and especially as we get towards early June, the Western Atlantic will generally become more favorable, and that's where we typically look at for our first development signs of the hurricane season. So there's really not much to see as to why this hurricane season will probably not be anything other than active this year. Makes sense given all the forecasts that have come out so far, except a few forecasts that are kind of hesitant on this season because maybe the Atlantic is not so warm, but I don't know. We'll see though. And we'll find out in 3 weeks in terms of how active this hurricane season will actually be. But once again, with the Nino 3.4 just kind of hammering the point home, a little bit of warming occurred over the last several weeks, over the last week or so, but we've not seen, especially since, like this, what we had here in early March, where we saw a huge spike in sea surface temperature anomalies. We're not seeing that. So once again, we're not rapidly heading towards some El Nino, and conversely, on the other side, we're not heading towards any sort of major La Nina. So ENSO neutral. And I really want to hammer that point home because the biggest thing, in my opinion, one of the biggest kind of keys in this hurricane season is the fact that we don't have an El Nino. I'll always say this. When we don't have an El Nino, it automatically puts us in a better position for the Atlantic to be active this season. And definitely looking at least with the Nino 3.4 right now, we're not heading towards an El Nino. So that definitely puts us in a better position. And taking a look at the SOI, yeah, the SOI is, I guess, tanked over the last several weeks. We're actually down in the negatives now with the SOI. We're at -1 with the latest 30-day average, but the 90-day is still at positive. And if you look at the daily contributions, makes sense as to why the SOI has kind of tanked over the last several weeks. Quite a bit of these negative contributions, some of them quite strong. In fact, yesterday and today, -13 and -16. So it makes sense why the SOI has tanked in recent days. But still, we're not into strong negative territory. And as long as we don't get into strong negative territory, I'm pretty sure, once again, we're not really going to see anything major in terms of ENSO. But now, since we're, talking, we kind of have all the factors kind of set up for this season. Now we're going to start getting into the actual season. And now it's actually time to start looking at actual signs for when we will get our first development. And as I mentioned, there's been quite a bit of talk this week about when are we going to get our first storm, especially because the models have kind of hinted at that at least this past week. The GFS has had its fun, and maybe I could show you some of these runs that the GFS had. Some of them were pretty crazy, but obviously most of them are fantasy runs, not going to happen. They had all these, major hurricanes in the Caribbean in May. That doesn't happen. But in general, the overall, kind of theme is that models have generally been starting to hint at activity, at least in the Western Atlantic, within the last few days. And now that we're starting to get closer to hurricane season, it's definitely something interesting to watch. So I'm going to kind of run the model, the GFS, the 6E run, kind of take a look at what's going on over the next several days. And you can kind of see, especially as we head into next week and as I kind of roll the model run out, you do start to see that we do have some vorticity try to gather over Central America. This is part of, the Central American gyre that we typically get this at this time of the hurricane season, where we have westerlies kind of come from the Eastern Pacific and we have easterlies come throughout the Caribbean, and then they kind of clash over Central America and form this sort of broad monsoonal low. And then depending on where it kind of tracks, if it's able to get into the Caribbean, sometimes it may develop and form a system in the Caribbean, or sometimes it does it in the Eastern Pacific, especially at this time of the year, since we're now heading into May, and we're now beginning to head into the start of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season. And oh, well, you look at that, right as we start heading into May 15th and now into May 16th. So this is days 5 and 6 on the GFS. You're starting to notice, you see the bundle of energy occurring in the Eastern Pacific right near Central America. And then I'm going to stop it at 7 days. Although if I were to actually continue this model run out into the 8 and 9 day time frame, yeah, the GFS is actually forming something in the Eastern Pacific, and that does actually look like a potential tropical system. But you do notice in general, things are beginning to bundle in the Eastern Pacific, potentially some energy trying to come together. And maybe, just maybe, we might have development that the model is trying to hint out. And it's not just the GFS too. Let's take a look at the actual ensembles. So not the operational, but the GFS ensembles, which is pretty much a bunch of different variations of the GFS model. And even with the ensembles too, you notice there are quite a bit of members that do hint at some of these low pressures trying to form, some in the Caribbean, and but really also some in the Eastern Pacific as well. And that makes sense given the GFS does try to form something in the Eastern Pacific, or at least you kind of see the signs of something trying to get going. And once again, this is May 17th. The Eastern Pacific hurricane season begins this upcoming week on May 15th. So, I mean, you can kind of just, put the pieces together and you could kind of make an assumption that maybe this might be onto something. We'll have to see. But really quickly, to kind of further this idea of whether or not something might happen, this is the climatology for May 11th to 20th in terms of points of origin, in terms of where storms develop. And we do get some things that sometimes develop in the Caribbean and maybe in the Bahamas in the month of May in the Atlantic, even though the hurricane season doesn't begin till next month. If you remember several years ago, we would always have something develop in May, especially off the southeast coast. We've not had May formation in quite some time in the Atlantic, but it does happen from time to time. But especially here in the Eastern Pacific, you see we also have some points of development that occur as well. And once again, the Eastern Pacific season begins this upcoming week. So we're starting to get to that time where we need to watch the tropics. And the signals are there. We're starting to see our first early signals of what may be potentially the first developments of this hurricane season. We'll watch it though, and we'll see if it is actually legit or not. But there's definitely been a lot of talk about it. And I'd say it's definitely something interesting to watch, as once again, we're now starting to head towards the mid to latter part of the month of May. That's typically when the Eastern Pacific starts to, try to squeeze something out. And maybe, just maybe, as we head towards the end of May and as we start getting into early June, we'll maybe need to watch the Caribbean and Gulf, where we typically see development in the Atlantic in June, for something to potentially develop as well. We'll see. We still have a little bit of time, though, to watch everything and see how it all plays out. Really quickly before we end, as I always do, let's take a look at weather occurring in our neck of the woods here in the United States right now. Not much happening today. We have some red flag warnings in effect for portions of the northern plains, including Montana, North and South Dakota, and a little bit of Minnesota. There's also some flood watches, I think. Yeah, these are flood watches in effect. Once again, as I mentioned, we do have this sort of system over the Gulf Coast today, so that's bringing rain to the south and especially to the Gulf Coast and into Florida. And you can see we have flood watches in effect. And there's also a system still bringing rain to portions of the Northeast, so we also have flood watches there. And in terms of what severe weather is looking like for today, as I mentioned, we have some rain and we have a system over the southeast. So a marginal risk in effect for portions of the Florida Peninsula and northern Florida as well. A little bit of a tornado risk and maybe some wind and hail. And we also have a marginal risk too for portions of the mountain northwest, Montana, and I think this is Idaho in here. So very interesting. They have some severe weather there too, although nothing significant. And the same remains for tomorrow. Some severe weather across the southeast, including Florida and maybe the Gulf Coast states. And also severe weather as well for the mountain northwest. And then as we head into day 3, still some severe weather over the southeast, although luckily we don't have anything on the high end scale. And that also remains the case as we head into the day 4 to 8 time period. Actually, never mind, I'm just seeing this for the first time. A 15% risk for portions of the Midwest, and this is on day 6. So this upcoming week, we might start getting a little bit more active with severe weather. I've also seen quite a bit of talk of that too, of potentially the Midwest and the Mid-South, and in general, the central eastern part of the United States potentially getting active with severe weather again once we head into potentially the next week or so, or maybe more like the 2-week time frame. Things might start getting more active with severe weather again. It makes sense because we're in the month of May, and this month is when we typically are very active with severe weather, so wouldn't be surprised to see that. But then once we get past that, once again, we'll be past May and we'll be into June, and we'll be at the start of hurricane season. So since we're getting very close to hurricane season, as I mentioned at the beginning, this past week was Hurricane Preparedness Week. And I mentioned that in my video last week. I hope you took some time to prepare this past week, maybe, get a hurricane plan ready for the season. If not, you still have a little bit of time left. So definitely make sure to use the time that you have now, roughly 3 weeks till the start of hurricane season, to get a plan ready. And make sure you are hurricane prepared. Luck always favors the prepared, and not those that are complacent and write things off. And especially if you were tracking the tropics for the last several years, you definitely know to not write things off, because especially the Atlantic always seems to throw surprises. And maybe we might get a surprise in the next week or so with something going on in the Caribbean. I doubt it, but we'll see. But in general, we might have our first signs of development soon, and certainly makes sense as we are getting closer and closer towards hurricane season. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off for this week's video. I'm going to be back this upcoming week on Thursday, since that is when is May 15th, and that is the beginning of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season. So I'm going to do a video kind of marking the beginning of that. Other than that, I'll be back next week, this time Saturday, for another weekly tropical weather video, as we typically do, and we'll continue to do this till the end of the month, until hurricane season begins next month. And then we'll probably be able to drop the weekly outlook videos and probably start doing these videos on probably a daily basis as we get into hurricane season. That time is once again coming very soon. And hurricane season, once again, is very soon, and it's just on our doorstep, and we're just a matter of weeks now away from it. Thanks for watching this week's video. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I always would. I forgot what I was going to say. I always say this every single week. I would really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe. Sometimes my brain farts. It happens to everybody. Forgive me. But I would really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends, and especially subscribe if you want to get my videos the moment I upload them. So stay tuned for that. Really, I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Go out, especially if you have nice weather today. Go out and enjoy it. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will talk again very soon.